I want to take just a few minutes to illustrate a few things about how you deal with the text in your papers, and I guess I'll begin by pulling up this PowerPoint slide that I had. This is from the presentation on comedy, and it says here, there's a slide that says approaching your paper. You have to move from your passage or episode to larger ideas and back from larger ideas to more specific episodes or passages. So the idea is you're using both a microscope and a telescope. And one of the problems that I noticed on the RSAs is that people were not spending enough time working closely with their chosen passage. And if you don't get really granular and specific about your chosen passage, you're not going to be able to say much. So it's ironic in a way, but the more you start to say about a small passage, the more you're actually going to end up saying about the text itself. So let me give you two examples. I'm going to start with the first example, and I did talk about this very briefly in lecture last day, but I want to now sort of tease it out a little more. So the induction, as I said when I was talking to you about this in the first place, is problematic because when you look up shrew in the OED, the first meaning is a shrewish man, not a woman. And we have this problem of the induction where Sly appears as a drunken, slovenly, recalcitrant pig of a man, and the hunting lords decide to play a trick on him and convince him that he's something that he's not. And I talked about this as a keynote to understanding the play because that is a kind of metaphor for what happens to Kate and Petruchio. Now, one of the problems I also said with this play is that there are two different versions. We think that the other one may or may not be Shakespeare's, but there's Taming of the Shrew and Taming of a Shrew. And so the Shrew is the Shakespeare edition. For sure, we know it was Shakespeare. A Shrew, the Taming of a Shrew, may or may not be Shakespeare. One of the problems is that the Taming of a Shrew has the return of Sly at the end of the play, and he returns he reappears as a kind of reformed man. So I'd suggested to you in lecture that this was a kind of metaphor for what happens to Kate during the play, and that is to say that Petruchio treats her positively and gets her to visualize herself in a way that she has not seen herself. And that the story of Sly is basically that same story told twice. So I have this passage here, Sly speaking in the induction scene 2. It says, "I am Christopher Sly, call me not honor nor worship. I ne'er drank sack in my life, and if I give you any, if you give me any conserves, give me conserves of beef. Ne'er ask me what raiment I wear, don't ask me what clothes I wear, because I've got no more stockings than legs, so only two. No more shoes than feet, sometimes more feet than shoes." And this is prose because it goes from one margin all the way to the other, and it isn't broken into lines. And then I told you that around line 66, Sly wakes up and he is told that he is this magnificent lord. And I want you to notice that he begins to speak in blank verse. So blank verse is kind of like poetry, but not. It's basically a decasyllabic line. So you see here there's 10 lines and 10 lines and 10 lines and 10 lines. There are two tumbling lines where the syllable count goes from 10 to 11. And I realize that I haven't talked to you yet about how to count syllables, so I'm just going to go into the next week's material from poetry. This is marking syllabic counts, and so there's a couple of ways to do it, but basically every syllable gets one count. So ad, mit, impediments, love is not love, and that works as 10. Excuse me. Or you can do it this way, separately, with each syllable separated by a slash. So I'm not counting iambs or anything like that. I'm just counting the total number of syllables per line. And it is interesting that in his drunken state, Sly speaks as a rustic in prose, but by the time he starts thinking about himself positively, his tenor of discourse is risen higher. So, in other words, he begins to speak in a blank verse. And you can see here that there's only 2 tumbling lines. You're probably wondering what the 4 plus 7 is. Well, I look at the punctuation in the line. In this case, it's a question mark. And to the left of it, am I a lord, is 4 syllables on the left. And then, and have I such a lady, is 7 on the right. So this is not like left and right branching sentences, but I am using punctuation to say breaks up into 4 syllables plus 7. Nevertheless, for the most part, Sly is speaking in 10-syllable lines. So if this is a microcosm for Kate, one of the things that you might want to do is to take a look at Kate's last speech. And she speaks that, by the way, in blank verse. And to see if there are other passages in the play where she speaks, and to see whether or not she speaks generally in prose, or whether she speaks in blank verse. And if she does speak in blank verse, is it usually 10-syllable lines, or is she a little more uneven than that? Now the problem, of course, is that the connection between Sly and the hunting lords, excuse me, on Petruchio and Kate, is that Petruchio goes one more step further than what the lords do. In other words, he doesn't just say to Kate, you're beautiful and you're perfect, but he goes to extra lengths to starve her and use sleep deprivation as ways to break her spirit. And so, in a way, the induction scene anticipates what Petruchio does to Kate, but in another way it does not, because Sly himself is not subject to those kinds of horrendous personal abuses, and that remains a problem in the play. So you've got a basis now for talking about ways in which the induction actually anticipates the rest of the play, but also in ways that it does not. And so now you've got a sophisticated positioning in this text where you're not simply reducing it to one thing, but you're saying there's a difficulty here in interpreting it. It could be done either way. So let me show you a second example. This is Act 2, Scene 1. Aren't you glad I'm not in the classroom coughing all over you? Oh my God. All right, so this is Act 2, Scene 1. This should actually be lowercase I. About line 180 following. And I think this is an excellent scene to work from because it's the first meeting between Kate and Petruchio. And it defines really their relationship. And I think that the key to understanding the ending, this is my read on the play, is to understand this particular passage as a microcosm of the whole play. And so it is a lively exchange between Kate and Petruchio. And the context for this, of course, is that Kate has been shunned by her father and by people around her. And Petruchio has the first line here where he says, "Good morrow, Kate, for that's your name, I hear." And she is instantly contrary and in denial of what he says. So she says, "Well, you have heard," in other words, you have heard correctly, "but something hard of hearing, you're deaf. They call me Catherine that do talk of me." So she's correcting him already and saying, basically, don't call me Kate, you need to call me Catherine by my full name. So in that contradiction of him, she's not being contradictory for the sake of being contradictory. She's putting up a boundary between herself and him, and rightly so, because he's walked into her life unannounced, and she doesn't know who he is, and so she says, "You don't get to call me informally, you can call me Catherine." And Petruchio instantly starts being contrary to her. So he says, you lie. In faith, you're called plain Kate, and bonny Kate, and sometimes Kate the cursed. But Kate, the prettiest Kate in Christendom, Kate of Kate Hall, my super dainty Kate, for dainties are all Kates, and therefore Kate. Kate, 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 Kate. And he is, this repetition of the same word Kate is him taunting her and repeating that word because she's already said, you can call me Catherine, not Kate. And he calls her Kate once, twice, 3 times, 4 times, 5 times, look at this, 6 times, 7 times, 8 times, 9 times, 10, 11. So she says, don't call me Kate, and he says, Kate, 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 Kate. However, I want you to notice that when Petruchio speaks to her, he's speaking in pretty well consistent decasyllabic blank verse. So his language is controlled. He's always 10 syllables per line, but the content is very provocative. And to me, the context seems to imply quite clearly that when she says, you know, you can call me Catherine, and he calls her Kate all those times. Oh, here's another one. He's trying to irritate her. Now, I've got a 10 question mark, 11 question mark here, because depends on how many syllables you put in this word. But Kate, the prettiest Kate in Christendom. Christendom is 3 syllables, making it 11. Or Christendom, if you can compress it, it might be 10. I think it's a tumbling line, but it's ambiguous. And so I am going to leave it at that. There is one aberration here, Kate of my consolation, and one aberration here, a tumbling line where he goes to 11. But for the most part, this is a controlled speech in syllabic meter, but not a controlled speech in terms of content. And he ends in a very rude and inappropriate way for someone that he's just met. He says, I am moved to woo thee for my wife. Moved means motivated, but it also means sexually aroused. And so it's Petruchio who starts this whole sexual undertone of their exchange. And Kate picks up on it right away. She says, moved, in good time. Like, you've just met me. What are you talking about? You're sexually aroused or motivated even. Either reading is okay. You don't even know me. Let him that moved you hither, whoever sent you here, remove you hence. I knew you at the first, you were immovable. I knew you were a flighty, unpredictable person. Petruchio, why? What's immovable? A joint stool. So a 3-sided stool, basically to sit on. And so she says joint stool. What I want you to understand is that Petruchio starts to pun off her puns. And this exchange between these two people is extremely witty. And the point I want to make about it is that they are an equal match for each other. They both dish out and get back equally. And so in this passage, Kate is Petruchio's equal. And she is ferocious in how she stands up to him. So she says joint stool, and he says, come sit on me, punning on her joint stool. But in a lot of productions, he makes some pretty obscene gestures, saying particularly where he wants her to sit. And so it's obviously rude and sexual in intention. And he starts to provoke her with these vulgar displays of sexuality. Again, he's meeting her for the first time. He doesn't know who she is, and he is obnoxious. And she rises to the occasion. So she says, you know, asses are made to bear, and so are you. You can sit on your ass, literally your ass, your buttocks, or a donkey or a mule. And Petruchio turns it around. Women are made to bear, that is to say, to bear children, and so are you. So my business is, when you become my wife, is for me basically to get you impregnated. And she denies it, saying no such jade, which is a horse. The OED says also it's a derogatory name for a woman. So she says, I am no such horse, and you're not going to ride me, and you're not going to dominate me. And Petruchio says, I won't burden you, and so on. So this exchange, let's talk about the movement in this passage so far, starts with what seems to be a controlled compliment. He calls her, the prettiest Kate in Christendom, and your mildness is praised in every town, so that's the positive thinking. The meter is very controlled, but underneath here it's Kate, 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 even though she doesn't want to be called it. So this is a provocation. The passage then moves into this exchange around sexual vulgarity. It turns now where Petruchio says, come, come, you wasp, in faith you are too angry. And he's using wasp as a symbol here, a metaphor for an annoying, buzzing creature that stings. And so Kate says, if I am a wasp, you better beware of my sting. And this will become, as you'll see in a minute, a phallic symbol, her stinger, suggesting that she has a phallus and is masculinized. And Petruchio says, well, then my remedy is to pluck it out. I'll remove your stinger. And she says, well, if you could find where it lies, if you could find it, and again, referring to genitalia in some way, if you can find it, you'll be lucky to find it. And Petruchio says, well, who knows not where a wasp lies, where's his sting? In his tail. So Kate, in his tongue, and this means in her language. But Kate says, yours if you talk of tails, but she also means tails here. And so, goodbye. She wants to end the conversation. There's no stage direction here, but the implication is that she, because she says farewell, that she somehow is going to turn around and walk away from him. And look what he says to her, with my tongue in your tail. So that is pretty well as graphic as it gets. It's a vulgar reference either to vaginal or anal penetration with his tongue, and it is, seems to me to be designed to get her to stop and turn around. And they come again, good Kate. She turns around because she can't believe what he said, and he claims that he's a gentleman. And she says, that I'll try, meaning I will test it to see if you're a gentleman. And this is where she hits him. And I think in some ways, because he has been so particularly vulgar, especially at the first meeting, but simply vulgar by any terms, it seems to me that in one sense she is justified in striking him because of that particularly rude comment. But she says that she's hitting him not because of what he said, but because she wants to see if he really is a gentleman and will not hit her back. And of course, this moment that I talk about, he says, I swear I'll cuff you if you strike again. He does not hit her back, meaning that basically he is a gentleman. And now and here's where the tide turns, she begins to provoke him. Well, you're going to lose your arms if you strike me. You are no gentleman, and if you're a gentleman, well, no arms. This arms here is a pun not only on your arms physically, but a coat of arms, and the chivalric coat. And look how Petruchio picks up on it right away. A herald, and heraldry is the study of coats of arms. And books here refers to the lineage of your family. And crest here refers to the family crest that would have been on all the knights' armor. And so he's saying, put me in your books. I would like to belong to your family. And she says, like, what royal crest do you have? So it's not like a lion in a crouching position, or a coxcomb is a rooster's comb on the head. You're a fool. So she begins to insult him, and what happens then, and this is the movement, so it goes from this controlled compliment to an exchange that is deliberately vulgar, but I want to just draw your attention to what happens here. And you have to pay attention to the line spacing, because the reason these lines are split like that is because this line here, what you mean my face, is the same line as Kate. Even though they are on separate lines, it's the same line number. Just let me get you that line number in the text so you know what I'm talking about here. Had I a glass, I would. Where is that? Coxcomb, okay. Right here. So it is line 225, 26, 227, 228. So this is actually a shared line. What you mean my face, what you mean my face, what you mean my face is 5 syllables. Oops. And he says, well aimed of such a young one. And he takes 6 syllables here. So he answers her with 1 more syllable, implying, perhaps with the 1 extra syllable, that he is trying to get control of her. Then line 232, actually, they share the line 3 ways, and it goes in a cycle. Kate says, you are withered. Petruchio says, 'tis with cares, and she says, I care not. So, yet you are withered is 5. 'Tis with cares is 3. Oops. And she says, I care not. So, what's happening is we have a tumbling line with 1 extra syllable, but I want you to notice now how she has echoed his word right here. So he says cares, and she echoes it back. I suggest to you that this is, again, a very subtle way of showing the 2 of them coming in sync, where they start to share lines of the exchange, suggesting they are becoming more compatible, and she starts to pick up on his vocabulary. And then it ends with this long speech by Petruchio saying, I find you passing gentle. So we began the passage with a speech by Petruchio. This is the circular part of how this passage moves. And you can see here that it's basically a pretty controlled decasyllabic speech. But I want you to look at the syllabic count here. No, not a whit, I find you passing gentle. 'Twas told me you were rough and coy and sullen, and now report a very liar. For you are pleasant, gamesome, passing courteous. So 11, 11, 11, 12 is an Alexandrine. And then he's got this shot, so he gives her all of this praise. You know, you are pleasant and gamesome, and you are sweet like springtime flowers. You don't bite your lip like angry wenches will. There's a couple of decasyllabic lines, and then he's back to these tumbling lines again. Calls her mild and gentle and soft and affable. And then, like to provoke her, he throws in this line. Everybody says you have a limp. And he says, you know, it's not true. You do not halt. To halt is to limp. So he is invoking the reputation that Kate knows she has with people, and he's telling her that people behind her back are saying that she limps. So he gives her praise, and then he takes it all back by making things up about how people are speaking ill of her. And I want you to notice now that he is much more unstable. There are fewer decasyllabic lines and more tumbling lines at the end of this speech. And what does it imply? Well, it might imply that he's kind of losing control a little bit, or becoming more emotional. And then we get this speech where he ends. This is the third speech. So the movement is in 3 speeches by Petruchio, with all of these exchanges in between. Marry, so I mean, sweet Catherine, in thy bed. And therefore, setting all this chat aside, so let's stop all this small talk. Your father has consented that you shall be my wife, your dowry is agreed on, and will you, nill you, I will marry you. So look at this. 12, 10, 11, 11, and then with confidence, here, I will marry you, 10 syllables. And look, 10 syllables, for I am your husband for your turn, for your pleasure, for by this light whereby I see thy beauty. Again, lots of decasyllabic lines. And then 3 more decasyllabic lines here, I'm born to tame you, and 1 here. So this is Petruchio settling down both in the content of his speech and in his meter, where now it's predominantly 10-syllable lines. So what do we have? Well, we have a passage where Petruchio is a kind of monitor of Kate. We have seen that he starts off with some deal of confidence and provokes her. We have seen in his middle passage that he is mixing things up a little bit. There's still lots of 10s, but he's uncertain. And then by the time he comes to the end, he's got a majority of 10-syllabic lines that he's finally settled. So the sparring between the two of them suggests that the battle has already been won metrically here by Petruchio. However, the point that I want to make is that she is certainly an equal match for him. She's just as quick with the wits. She does not take his insults with any ease. She fights back, she pushes back. And this spirit of hers is what is most like in him. The two of them are, I want to argue, the same. So what does this mean in terms of the end of the play? Well, you'll have to go to that and take a look at Kate's metrical syllabic count at the end as well. But to me, it suggests that this part of her spirit has been tamed, that she has now lost this ability to resist him insult for insult, sexual insult for sexual insult, that all of that has been removed. And so to read the play this way, I think, makes some sense. Now, you can argue other endings, but I just want you to see that I can move from this passage to the larger play. So just a note to you guys, when you are working with your specific passage, you need to really dig in and get granular with that passage, and don't just gloss it over. Spend some real time thinking about it, and then zoom out and talk about other passages in the play that you might be able to compare. So I hope you find that useful.